This museum is telling it wrong, and the dead can no longer speak. That's not correct. A hoarse, low voice cut through the crowded SAS exhibition hall. The guide stopped. Sir, this information is based on declassified military records. The insertion point wasn't there. The 85-year-old man, Arthur Hale, tightened his grip on the walking stick in his hand. 30 kilometers southwest, by the stone bridge. Locals called it Devil's Crossing. A young visitor laughed. Another old man who thinks he knows more than history. The backpack straps are wrong. Arthur continued slowly. The real ones were reinforced with leather. Canvas tears under full combat load. The atmosphere shifted. A few people turned to look. A few grew visibly irritated. Sir, nobody paid to hear your stories, Evan Brooks said loudly, making sure the whole room heard him. Arthur remained silent. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He didn't defend himself. He simply looked at the glass display case where the artifacts were neatly labeled and held his walking stick tightly, as if holding on to something heavier than memory itself. His silence didn't stop the moment. It weighed down the entire room. If you believe that true courage isn't found in the sound of gunfire, but in the silence of those who have walked through war, subscribe to Brave Veteran Stories so that together we may preserve the memory, dignity, and reverence owed to our heroes. Arthur Hale stepped back toward the corner of the room, where fewer eyes tended to linger. He did not leave. He simply chose a place far enough away to avoid disturbing anyone further, yet close enough to clearly see the artifacts behind the glass. His hand tightened around the worn wooden cane, the veins in his fingers whitening for a brief moment before relaxing again. It was a small, familiar gesture, the way a man reminds himself to stay standing. He said nothing. He did not object. He did not explain. The crowd split cleanly into two opposing currents. Some people turned away, irritation written on their faces at the interruption of the tour. Others looked at him longer, their gaze settling on shoulders weighed down by years, on a faded old coat, on a posture held upright through effort rather than ease. No one stepped forward. No one asked a question. The silence opened a hollow space that no one dared to enter. The sounds of the museum suddenly grew unnervingly sharp. The soft scuff of shoes against the floor. The steady hum of the air conditioning overhead. Children laughing faintly in a distant gallery. Everything became clearer. As if once words had fallen away, all that remained was forced to speak for itself. Arthur looked into the glass case. The labels were neat, precise. Dates, numbers, unit markings. He read them slowly as though weighing each word. Some details were correct. Some were missing. And some to him were not exactly wrong, only incomplete. Because they were things that never made it into records. They lived in the memories of those who were no longer here. He's being quiet, a voice whispered somewhere behind him. Arthur heard it, but he did not turn around. He was used to people talking about him as if he did not exist. He was used to being judged by appearances alone. He had nothing to prove. The cane in his hand had once been planted in burning sand, had once kept him upright when his legs threatened to give way. Compared to those days, today's glances could not shake him. The guide resumed the presentation, her voice steady practice delivered exactly as rehearsed. Arthur did not interrupt again. He only listened. Each sentence passed through him like a thin cut, not deep enough to hurt, but sharp enough to awaken that familiar feeling of being overlooked. He was not angry, only saddened by the empty spaces no one realized were there. A middle-aged woman glanced at him, her eyes pausing on the hand gripping the cane. She seemed about to say something, then thought better of it. A younger man folded his arms and exhaled softly, as if hoping the moment would pass quickly. Evan Brooks stood a few steps away, his expression caught between smugness and irritation. To him, Arthur's silence felt like an admission of being wrong, and that satisfied him. Arthur remained still. He did not leave. He did not resist. He thought of the silences he had kept before. Silence when a comrade's name was read incorrectly. Silence when a death notice listed a cause that was not the truth. Silence when he came home and could not speak of what he had seen. This silence was not weakness. It was discipline, something learned early on when words could ruin everything. His hand tightened on the cane once more, very gently. No one noticed. No one saw that in that instant he was reminding himself that he was still here, that those memories had not vanished simply because they were never spoken aloud. And then, among the indifferent and pitying glances, another pair of eyes rested on him, without judgment, without mockery, quietly recognizing what everyone else had failed to see. Evan Brooks didn't stop. To him, Arthur's silence wasn't dignity, it was an open space, an invitation to press further. Evan leaned forward, his voice raised just enough to draw a few more glances from those around them. "Where did you buy that stuff?" The question rang out clearly. It didn't need emphasis to carry its contempt. A few people turned around. Someone smirked. Someone else shook their head slightly, as if not wanting to get involved. Evan smiled the smile of someone who felt the crowd was on his side. His eyes dropped to the small insignia on Arthur's coat, and he reached out, touching it with the tip of his finger. "Looks pretty real," Evan went on. "You can buy things like this online so easily now." Arthur flinched just slightly. Not from pain, but because that touch landed in a place Evan could not see. The small insignia, its edges worn smooth, had been removed and reattached many times. It had once belonged to another man before it reached Arthur, a man who never came back to grow old with it. "Hey, careful," a voice called out somewhere nearby, half joking, half uneasy. A few scattered laughs followed. Not loud, not cruel enough to stop, but enough to ripple outward like small waves on water. Arthur looked down at Evan's hand as it withdrew. He didn't speak. He didn't step back. He simply pulled his coat closed, covering the object that had just been touched, slowly, deliberately. His hand paused for a beat, as if to make sure it was still exactly where it belonged. "See," Evan said to the person beside him, his voice lower now, but still audible. "Guess he doesn't want to tell the truth." Arthur heard it. He heard it clearly. His hearing wasn't as sharp as it once had been, but he had been hearing words like that his entire life after the war. He had stood in other rooms with other people listening to softer words that carried the same distance. He knew this feeling well, the feeling of being turned into a footnote in his own story. A young woman looked at Arthur, uncertainty flickering across her face. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. A middle-aged man shrugged and turned back to the information board as if what was happening had nothing to do with him. Indifference spread faster than laughter ever could. Arthur remained still. He did not respond. He did not look at Evan. He fixed his gaze on the glass case ahead. Inside, the artifacts were neatly arranged, each accompanied by a clear label. There were no labels for sleepless nights. No lines for names never carved into headstones. No place for objects passed hand to hand in silence when promises mattered more than paperwork. "You're not going to say anything?" Evan asked, his voice lower this time, as if trying to pull Arthur into a conversation. "Or, you don't know what to say?" Arthur closed his eyes for the briefest moment. When he opened them again, his expression hadn't changed. No anger, no pleading, just a tired steadiness. He had learned long ago not to let words like these drag him away from the place he had chosen to stand. Sometimes a reaction was exactly what the other person wanted. A quiet chuckle rose from somewhere behind Evan, then died out just as quickly. The air grew heavy, too tense to explode, too thick to simply drift away. Evan began to sense that the attention was no longer fully on his side. But he had gone too far to stop gracefully now. "Come on," Evan said, his voice carrying one last note of mockery. "I'm just asking." Arthur didn't answer. He turned the cane lightly in his hand, shifting his weight. A small movement, but one filled with resolve. He wasn't leaving, and he wasn't there to win or lose. He was there because some things could not be abandoned, even when they were laughed at. And in that moment, as the laughter faded and discomfort spread, another man stepped forward from behind the crowd, his eyes settling on Arthur. And in that gaze, everything changed. The man stepped forward without haste. He didn't interrupt, didn't raise his voice. He simply took one more step and stopped at a distance just close enough to see Arthur's arm more clearly. Daniel Wright, a former Marine, was used to observing before acting. It wasn't a habit learned in museums. It was a reflex that remained long after leaving the service. Daniel's eyes didn't go to Arthur's face. They settled on the forearm briefly exposed as Arthur adjusted his coat. A faded tattoo, its color washed thin by years. A winged dagger. Beneath it, a string of old numbers unlike any modern format. Daniel held his breath for a fraction of a second. He had seen that image before, not in person, but in rare documents and quiet conversations among those who had once served. L Detachment. The first ones. Men who inherited nothing but the mission. Daniel stepped half a pace closer. His voice stayed low enough for Arthur to hear, not enough to spark another confrontation. "Sir." He paused as if making certain he wasn't mistaken. "That tattoo, is it from 1942? Arthur turned his head. His eyes met Daniel's. There was no scrutiny, no defensiveness, only a recognition that came slowly, deeply. He looked at the man before him, the way he stood, the way he kept his distance, the way his voice carried no cheap curiosity. "Where did you serve?" Arthur asked in return, his voice rough but steady. "Marines," Daniel replied. "Retired." Arthur gave a very slight nod. Just one. But in that nod was enough acknowledgement for Daniel to know he had asked the right question. L detachment. Daniel continued, no longer phrasing it as a question. An old service number, not used for a long time. The air around them shifted. Those nearby began to fall silent. Whispers spread soft but urgent. Someone leaned in to look again at Arthur's arm. Someone else began to realize that what had just happened was no longer a trivial dispute. Arthur drew in a slow breath. He hadn't intended to say it aloud. But there are questions which, when asked the right way, leave no reason to avoid an answer. "Sergeant Arthur Hale," he said, "served from 1942 to 1945. The words landed gently. There was no display of pride, no expectation of recognition. They were spoken as a simple fact, one that had existed too long to require embellishment. Daniel straightened slightly. He didn't salute by regulation. He merely inclined his head, a gesture understood by those who had once worn a uniform. Arthur noticed, and for a rare moment his eyes softened. Around them, the crowd began to stir. Evan Brooks said nothing now. The smile he'd worn earlier had vanished, replaced by an unmistakable unease. He looked at Daniel, then at Arthur, then back at the tattoo he had touched moments before in ignorance. No one laughed anymore. The scattered chuckles had disappeared, as if they had never existed. A voice whispered from behind. "That can't be," another replied even more quietly. Arthur didn't look around. He didn't need to know what they were thinking. What he had said wasn't meant to convince a crowd. It was simply an answer to one man who had recognized the symbol before the person. Daniel stepped back half a pace and took out his phone. He didn't say what he was about to do. He only looked at Arthur once more, his expression now carrying a seriousness entirely different from before. "Excuse me, sir," Daniel said briefly. Arthur nodded. He didn't ask. He didn't stop him. He was used to things beginning with actions that required no explanation. A few seconds later, Daniel turned away and made a short call, and from that moment on, the gears of something far larger began to turn quietly but irreversibly. 3 men appeared almost at the same time without noise, yet enough to create a natural clearing in the crowd. They were all advanced in age, hair streaked with gray, their movements no longer quick, but their posture still carried the straightness of men shaped by discipline. Their jackets were plain, without displayed rank, yet every small gesture gave off something difficult to name authority that needed no introduction. The man in front stopped before Arthur. He looked straight at him, not probing, not doubtful, just looking. It was the look of someone who had read enough history to know that some pages were never printed. Sergeant Arthur Hale. His voice was low and steady, free of bureaucratic confirmation. Arthur lifted his head. Yes, all 3 men came to attention at once. No command was spoken. No signal given. The movement happened naturally, precisely like a reflex that had survived decades. The crowd did not immediately understand what was happening, but the change in the air was unmistakable. "Sir," the man in the center spoke, his voice trembling slightly. "We are SAS, retired." Arthur paused just for a fraction of a moment, then nodded. "We were informed that you were here," the second man continued, "and that you served in the very first generation." The third man looked at Arthur, his eyes carrying undisguised respect. From the same era as David Stirling. The name fell like a marker in time. No explanation was needed. No further detail required. A few people in the crowd began to grasp the true weight of the moment. Whispers stopped. Playful expressions vanished. Arthur stood still. He did not answer right away. He studied the 3 faces before him, the seriousness in each gaze. He had met many officers in his life. Not all of them stood like this before an old soldier without rank. "We never thought we would meet someone from that time," the man in the center said, his voice lower now. "The men who laid the foundation for everything we now carry on our shoulders." Arthur drew in a slow breath. "We only did our part," he replied. "There was no foundation." The answer was not modest. It was simple, and that simplicity silenced the room completely. No one laughed. No one commented. Even the guide stood frozen, gripping her folder without turning another page. Evan Brooks stood not far away. He watched the scene unfold, the way the three men stood at attention before Arthur, the way the mood of the entire room had shifted. He swallowed hard. His earlier words returned with painful clarity. In that moment, he understood that he hadn't merely insulted a difficult old man. He had insulted a piece of history he had never tried to understand. "Sir," the SAS officer continued, his tone slower now, "we didn't come to cause a scene, and we didn't come to honor you." Arthur looked at him. "Then why did you come to listen?" the man replied. "If you're willing." The words stopped Arthur, not because he hesitated, but because for the first time in a very long while someone had asked him with the right purpose, not to put him on display, not to hear a comfortable story, just to understand. Arthur looked around at the unfamiliar faces now standing before him, people who had unintentionally become witnesses. Then he gave a very slight nod. "If you want to know," he said, "then listen to all of it." And from that moment on, Arthur no longer stood as someone being judged. He was invited into the place of one who tells the truth, not to be celebrated, but to help those who came after understand what history had forgotten. Arthur did not stand up. He simply lowered his voice as if what he was about to say did not need to carry far, only to be heard in the right way. "In 1943, he began, we were given a mission with no name." The room fell silent. No one interrupted. No records. No signatures. No way out. Arthur paused briefly. "Just one sentence. If we didn't do it, a lot of people back home would die." He spoke of 5 men. He did not say their names at first. He only said, "we." A small team pushing deep into North Africa, walking through regions where maps had become little more than guesses. They carried enough ammunition for a few encounters, enough water for a few days, and enough silence that no one would ever know they had existed. The target was first described as a research depot, Arthur said. But when we got close, everyone knew it wasn't a depot. He spoke of underground structures, guarded ventilation shafts, drawings recovered during an initial contact. These weapons were not built merely to explode. They were designed to kill without being seen. Arthur did not use technical terms. He spoke plainly. Chemicals. Missiles. British cities were already marked. A quiet intake of breath sounded somewhere in the crowd. Arthur continued, his voice even never rising, as if the emotion had been processed long ago. "We were compromised," he said. "Someone told them we were coming." No one asked who had betrayed them. Arthur did not say. He only explained that the team was forced to change plans. They staged a diversionary attack on a supply convoy large enough to pull attention away. The middle of the night. A quick decision. And an unspoken truth, there would not be enough men to come back. "We entered the underground facility before dawn," Arthur went on. "Deeper than expected. More levels than planned." He paused, resting his hand on the cane, tightening his grip slightly. "Down there." There was no doubt anymore. Arthur spoke of devices never publicly acknowledged, of sealed containers of calculations, showing ranges long enough to cross the sea. He did not describe everything. He said only what needed to be said. "We planted explosives everywhere we could," he said. "And we knew there wouldn't be time for all of us." He spoke of gunfire in the tunnels, of choosing between holding position and carrying the documents out, of the moment when men fell one by one, no one calling their own name, no one crying out, only doing what remained. So the man beside them could have a few more seconds. 4 of them didn't make it out. Arthur said, his voice dropping, but not breaking. They knew that, even before I did. He explained that he was the one who carried the documents, not because he was stronger, but because at that moment he was the only one still standing. He walked for days through enemy territory, evading pursuit, constantly changing direction. He no longer remembered how long he walked. He only remembered that when he was finally found, he was still clutching those papers inside his clothing. When I got back, Arthur said everything had already been decided. He did not describe the meetings. He only said the program was erased, never mentioned again. The dead were recorded under a different cause, safer, cleaner, easier for their families to accept. I was told never to speak of it, he continued. And I didn't. For nearly 80 years. The room was completely still. Evan lowered his head, not in shame anymore, but because for the first time he understood the weight of what he had never known. Arthur looked around, his gaze resting on each face. You ask why I stayed silent, he said. Because there are truths that once spoken bring no justice to the dead, only comfort to the living. He paused. His breathing slowed. But today, he said, perhaps the time has come. And as the final words settled, the truth was no longer just a story, it became a cost that the people in that room were facing for the very first time. Evan Brooks took a step forward, then stopped. He no longer carried the posture of someone who enjoyed winning with words. His shoulders sagged. His eyes no longer avoided the moment, yet still couldn't bring themselves to meet Arthur's gaze. He lowered his head slowly, as if afraid that bowing too quickly would make the apology feel lighter than it was meant to be. "I'm sorry," Evan said. His voice was rough, the words not fully formed. "I didn't know. I said things I never should have said." Arthur looked at Evan. He didn't answer right away. Not to create distance, but to be certain that the young man in front of him was truly saying what he meant. Arthur had heard enough rushed apologies in his life, words spoken to escape a moment, not to change anything. Arthur nodded. "Just once." "You don't need to apologize to me," he said. "You didn't take anything away from me." Evan looked up confused. "But Arthur raised a hand, stopping him. "Listen to the rest first." The room fell completely silent. No one interrupted. No one moved. Arthur spoke slowly in short sentences, the way he always did when the words mattered. "We don't need our names remembered," he said. "We just need you to live in a way that's worthy." The sentence wasn't loud, but it carried far. Evan swallowed hard. The people standing nearby straightened without realizing it, as if they had just received an order that didn't need to be shouted. Arthur lowered his gaze slightly, then began to speak the names. He didn't look at a paper. He didn't pause to explain. Each name was spoken once clear, exact, without addition or emphasis. Thomas, Edward, Michael, James. 4 names, no last names, no ranks. Just names the way they called one another during long nights when tomorrow wasn't guaranteed. Arthur paused after each one long enough for the listeners to understand that this wasn't a list. These were people. They were in their early 20s, Arthur continued. Some never made it home. Some never even had time to send a letter. Evan closed his eyes. A woman raised a hand to her mouth. An older man clenched his hands together. No one cried out loud. No one needed to. Arthur looked up. They didn't die to be honored, he said. They died believing that someone else would live. A long silence followed. Then one by one, people in the room stood straight. No command was given. No signal passed. The movement happened like a shared instinct, natural, solemn. Evan stood as well, his arms at his sides, not because he knew the protocol, but because respect left him no other choice. Arthur watched them. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened. Not because he was being recognized, but because those names had finally been heard. That's enough, Arthur said quietly. You've heard them. That's all that matters. Evan took another step forward. I'll remember, he said. I promise. Arthur looked at him. No need to promise, he replied. Just do it. He turned the cane lightly in his hand, shifting his stance. A small motion, one that signaled his part was finished. The people around him understood. No one stopped him. No one tried to hold him there. Arthur began to walk away, slow but steady. He didn't look back. What needed to be said had been said. What needed to be heard had been heard. And as Arthur prepared to leave that room, carrying no title, no praise, he left behind something far heavier, a legacy that compelled those who remained to live differently. Arthur paused before fully leaving the room. He didn't turn back out of sentiment. He turned back because there was one last thing he had to do. He loosened his grip on the cane, then slowly slipped his hand into the old coat pocket, one that had been mended many times. He took out a thick envelope, the paper yellowed with age, the edges softened from being folded and unfolded for decades. This, Arthur said, his voice low but clear, shouldn't have stayed in my hands for so long. He passed the envelope to the nearest SAS officer. There was no ceremony, no photographs, just the simple act of returning something to where it truly belonged. Inside were the coordinates of the underground facility destroyed all those years ago, and letters that had never been sent. Lines written hastily in the night ink, uneven and faded, carrying the final words of men who knew they might not come back. They wrote to their families, Arthur said. I promised to keep them, but I never promised to keep them forever. The officer accepted the envelope with both hands. He nodded, not speaking right away. There was no curiosity in his eyes, only responsibility. "We'll do this properly," he said. "There will be a memorial, an official one." Arthur didn't reply. He only gave a slight nod, as if the answer had come late but was still necessary. Around them, people began to understand that this moment no longer belonged to the museum. It belonged to history being returned to its rightful place. Evan Brooks stepped back, his phone still in his hand. He was no longer recording to capture something sensational. He was recording because he knew that if he didn't, maybe no one would. The short video spread quickly. No dramatic narration, no background music. Just an old man speaking about those who never had the chance to grow old. Within hours, the story appeared in places Arthur had never imagined, on the screens of the young, in the living rooms of families who had only known the name SAS from textbooks. The comments no longer asked, "Is it true?" They asked, "Why are we only hearing this now?" Arthur didn't watch it. He didn't need to. He had finished his part. As he walked out of the museum, his steps were slow, but his back was straighter. Not because he felt fully relieved, but because the weight had finally been shared. 78 years of silence don't disappear in a single afternoon. But they no longer rested on one man alone. He stopped at the doorway and took a deep breath, not to preserve the moment, but to let go. The names, the faces, the sleepless nights, they were all still there. But now they had a place in the world of the living. "There are battles that are never recorded," Arthur said, as if speaking to himself. "But without them, this world would not exist." He turned and walked away. No one called after him. No one ran to ask for another story. True respect sometimes is allowing someone to leave in silence. If this story makes you believe that honor and kindness never retire, please, share this video and subscribe to Brave Veteran Stories so that none of their memories are ever forgotten. Brave Veteran Stories. We remember the quiet heroes,